So welcome everyone to the WEAC TCTAC EPA Region 2 New York, New Jersey Environmental Health and Justice Leadership Training led by Dr. Martinez on clean air and climate. Next slide. So just some logistics. This meeting is being recorded, so don't worry. You'll be able to watch this later on if there's a lot of information and you're diligently taking notes. Also, please keep yourself muted. We have you all muted, and we will have a Q&A session where you will be able to either drop questions throughout the presentation in the chat box or take yourself off mute. And then also when we are in that open Q&A session, please do raise your hand and you will be called upon and unmuted to ask your question. Next slide. So we always like to start with a bit of grounding. What is the TCTAC? As many of you may or may not know, WEAC was awarded last April to be leading the TCTAC in Region 2's New York and New Jersey region. TCTAC stands for the Environmental Justice Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center Program. It is a grant administered from the EPA and the DOE, and there's 16 centers across the United States. We share Region 2 with our partners in Inter-American University of Puerto Rico, who are focused on USVI and Puerto Rico. And for us, for the New York, New Jersey region, we also serve the 10 tribal communities as well. And really, we look to power real solutions for communities, ensuring that they can take advantage of not just federal, but state and local grants and build projects in their communities that they feel is fit for environmental justice issues. And so we're really excited to be serving you all. And with that, I'll go to the next slide. I'll pass it to Dr. Martinez, who will be leading our environmental health and justice leadership training on clean air and climate. Take it away, Dr. Martinez.
Sounds good. Thank you, Sada. So hi, everybody. Welcome tonight to our environmental justice leadership training. I'm really delighted to have all of you on the call. And so tonight we're going to talk about a few things. I do have quite a bit of materials in this training, and I will be sending all of these slides around. So in some slides that might look a little bit wordy, I left all the information on there for your reference, knowing that you'll have these slides in hand to go over any definitions or plots later on that you might be interested in. Okay, so tonight, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk a little bit about what is justice, and then we're going to review environmental justice, health disparities, and structural racism in the US. And then we're going to move into talking about climate change. So I really want to start with the 101 of climate change. And then we're going to discuss the intersection between climate change and air pollution. And then finally end the night with discussions of how air pollution or air pollutants affect our health. And then throughout, please feel free to raise your hand. I think that when you raise your hand, you should kind of come up to the top on Zoom, and I'll be able to see you and answer any questions that you have. Okay, wonderful. So let's get started. And so let's first talk about justice. Well, I want to take us through this giving tree example. Some of you may have seen this before, but for those of you that haven't, I really like this example when walking through to try to understand justice. And so what we see here is that we have these two children who have unequal access to the fruit of this tree. As you can see, this tree is leaning over to the left and has more fruit growing on the left side. So the child on the left has more access to the fruit of that tree than the child on the right. This is what we would call inequality, because it's unequal access in this case to food, but we can also think about unequal access to a whole number of opportunities and resources. And then when we talk about equality, then equality would be best illustrated by the case where we then recognize that both of those children need to be able to reach the fruit of that tree. And so then we give them the same tool to be able to assist them with access. So in this case, we give each child a ladder that's the same height. But what you can see is even though this is equality in terms of the ladder that we've given them, still the child on the left has more access to the fruit of that tree than the child on the right. Which then brings us to the concept of equity. So in in equitable setting, what we would do is we would account for the fact that the children have unequal access, and we would adjust the tools that are given appropriately. So now the child on the right has a taller ladder to account for the fact that that tree was leaning over. But you can still see that there are some issues with this picture. The tree still has more fruit on the left-hand side, and the child still has more access on the left. And so this really brings us to the concept of justice. And so in a justice framework, we would look at that picture and say, well, what was wrong with what was setting up this inequality from the first place? And it was that that tree was leaning over. And so in a justice framing, we would go and try to fix the broken system. And so in this case, fix the tree leaning so that we have equal distribution of fruit across the whole tree, and then you don't have that inequality. So that's really the difference between equity and justice. And so when we're talking about environmental justice and just justice overall, especially in a US context, we really have to think about structural racism. So the definition that I find kind of most useful of structural racism is a totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination via mutually reinforcing and equitable systems. And when we're talking about these mutually reinforcing and equitable systems, we're talking about things like community disinvestment, differences in policing in neighborhoods, differences in inequities in home ownership, in the distribution of educational resources, health resources, and also the distribution of environmental exposures such as pollutants. And one of the really important things to think about when considering these systems of structural racism in the US is that these are mutually reinforcing systems. These do not operate in a silo. So oftentimes it's the same communities that are experiencing an overburden of pollution that are also experiencing under-resourced schools and other forms of community disinvestment and systematic oppression. And so when we are talking about environmental justice is really addressing one aspect of structural racism. And there are many, many definitions of environmental justice floating around, and there is not one perfect definition. According to the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights, environmental justice is a fair treatment of people of all races, income, and cultures with respect to the development and implementation of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And really having the meaningful involvement of all people, and especially people from marginalized communities, when it comes to decision-making processes related to the environment. But one thing I really want to flag to you, and something that I feel is a really important point, is that trying to find one perfect definition of environmental justice is probably not the way to go. So I had pulled up a quote from an EJ professor, Ryan Holyfield, who says the pursuit of a stable consensual definition of environmental justice and environmental racism is misguided. We must accept that people in different geographic, historical, and political institutional contexts understand the term differently. And so I think that's really important, is that environmental justice needs to be centered in each environmental justice community and what EJ means to them. And so just that's to give you a little bit of context. Okay, and then one other thing that I really want to talk about, which we have to consider, especially in the US context of environmental justice, is environmental racism and how harmful environmental racism is. And so in the United States, Black communities are disproportionately, and communities of color in general, are disproportionately impacted by the cumulative exposures of pollutants, and these are pollutants in air, water, soil, our homes, etc. And I just wanted to give you a couple of stats to be able to kind of ground some of this information. So people of color in the US are 61% more likely than white people to live in a county that has at least one failing grade of an air pollutant. And so, this is showing that people of color are more likely to be experiencing higher burdens of air pollution. And then according to Health and Human Services, as of 2020, Black children have an asthma death rate that's 7.6 times higher than white children. And so we see that some of these environmental exposures are really driving health disparities. And one thing that's really important to keep front of mind when considering statistics such as these is that the disparities that we're seeing in communities of color around the United States are not just tied to income. Oftentimes, when I talk about um, health disparities and environmental burdens, people will often say, well, isn't this all really because of income, that communities of color tend to be lower income and therefore it's more of a poverty-driven cycle? But in fact, there has been research showing that if you compare households with similar incomes, so Black, white, and Latinx households in the US with similar incomes have dissimilar environmental quality and dissimilar environmental exposures. So we know that even if you account for differences in income, that we still see this environmental racism playing a role. And I just wanted to give you an example of how this plays out in New York City, which is where I live. And so here, what I did is I pulled some data from our community health profile. So New York City is broken up into 56 community districts. So these are all neighborhoods. I live in Harlem, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood. And similar to Harlem, there are many other communities throughout New York City that are predominantly people of color. And so what I did was I took for every single community district, just calculated the percent of the population that's non-white, so the percent of the population that's people of color, and then I plotted that against the rate of childhood asthma emergency room visits. And so the points that are on the left of the plot are predominantly white communities, and so around 80% or so white. And then as we move to the right of the plot, and hopefully you can see my cursor, these are predominantly Black and Latino communities. So in many cases, over 90% people of color. And what we see is this exponential increase in the childhood asthma emergency room visits. And this is even if we account for the number of children in each neighborhood. And so what this is showing us is a very striking health disparity that's arising from a plethora of environmental burdens that these neighborhoods are facing. And one thing that's really important to note is that these types of environmental health disparities actually can be seen all throughout the life course, from when we're born until when we die. And so here I plotted a number of similar health disparities where we see higher rates in communities of color in New York City. And so this includes infant mortality. I already showed you childhood asthma, diabetes, and then premature mortality. So from the start of our life until the end of our life, communities of color are experiencing these disproportionate effects on our health. And all of these diseases are diseases that have been linked to environmental conditions. And so the way that I think of health disparities is kind of similar to an oil rig. So if you ever seen a picture of an oil rig that operates, let's say, in the Gulf of Mexico, what you can see is on the top of the water, you see this big piece of infrastructure. But what we don't see is that underneath the water, there's all of this hidden infrastructure. And I think of health disparities is really that that kind of measurable, observable thing that we see at the top. It's the kind of manifestation of the environmental racism and environmental exposures that are oftentimes kind of hidden in plain sight and underneath. And so I also like to point out that these health disparities, just like an oil rig, are man-made, and therefore they can be disrupted. And so they're based in systems that we can actively work to correct and break down. And so that's what organizations like We Act and other environmental organizations seek to do, and other social justice organizations as well. Okay, so did anybody have any questions when it comes to thinking about the framing of environmental justice and how that ties to health disparities? And because next we're going to be talking about climate change. Okay, I don't see any hands raised, but if anyone if something comes up and you raise your hand within the next couple of minutes, I'm definitely also happy to answer. Okay, so let's talk about climate change, because climate change is a major area of focus for environmental justice organizations. And so one of the things, and I like to, whenever I talk about climate change, I always like to start from the beginning, because I think it's very helpful for all of us to have like a foundational knowledge of climate change to really be able to engage in the subject. And so, okay, when we talk about climate change, one of the most important things to know from the beginning is that we have to make a distinction between weather and climate. So weather describes the current conditions and the near-term conditions. So weather is really more about kind of a short time horizon feature. When we check the app on our phone and we say, okay, what's the temperature going to be today? What's it going to be next week? That's talking about the weather. Even if we're talking about, what's it going to be like next month? That's typically talking about the weather, whereas climate is just describing weather patterns over much longer time horizons. And these time horizons are often over many years, many decades, and oftentimes even thousands of years, depending on what types of climate factors we're discussing. And so when it comes to information about climate change, the best source worldwide is the International Panel on Climate Change, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it's often abbreviated as IPCC. So this is a United Nations body that sets out to assess all of the science related to climate change. And it really is the IPCC is the scientific body that really made the determination that climate change is driven by human activities. And so I've dropped the IPCC website link here. And I also have a QR code that will come up in the next slide in case you want to check out the website. But one of the really important things about the IPCC is that it conducts a regular assessment of the science of climate change and also the impacts of climate change and options for us to adapt and mitigate climate change. So what does that mean? Adapt means for us to prepare for changes in our climate and make sure that our cities and our infrastructure and communities are more resilient. Mitigation means that we're actively trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, pull greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, and essentially trying to stop the continuation of climate change. And so just to give you kind of a history of the scientific assessment of climate change done by the IPCC in 1990 was the first IPCC assessment report. And so, we're only looking at several decades of work that we've really been as a planet and also the scientific community really coming together on this issue. And then the second report came out in 1995, and we've had reports periodically. It's really important to note that it was just last year in 2023 when the sixth assessment report was released. And the one before that it had been a decade that we had been waiting for a new climate report. And so this is a really big deal that now the scientific community has kind of updated information from the IPCC for us to work off of. And if you would like, I've included a QR code here for you to be able to explore the IPCC website. usually when I have more than an hour for these talks, I usually have people go into breakout groups and discuss some of these reports, because it's actually really fun to look on the website. It is such a vast amount of information, and you can find information on there that everything from like being highly technical to reports all the way to reports that are for policymakers and community members and are really digestible. So I highly encourage you to check out the website. And so one of the really important things when it comes to these IPCC assessments, such as the one that came out in 2023, is that they're always big headline statements. So the scientific community comes together and they're charged with, making statements about what the state is of the climate. And so the headline statement from the 2018 report said that human influence on the climate system is clear, and that recent anthropogenic emissions, so this means like human-driven emissions of greenhouse gases, is the highest that we've had in history. And the reason that it's really important for all of us as citizens and just like stewards of our environment to understand some of this nitty-gritty when it comes to climate change is because we still face an environment where climate skeptics will try to utilize people's lack of the foundational information to try to disregard climate science. And I wanted to play this little piece from NPR. This was from 2018, but it's going to be very relevant in this presidential cycle, kind of showing that how at some of the highest levels, there's still climate skepticism. And let me play.
All right, now a story about the science and the politics of climate change. The planet has been warming for decades. 2018 is on track to be one of the hottest years on record. This year, we also saw a bunch of new and more precise predictions from scientists about what climate change is doing to the weather. The Trump administration questions that science. NPR's Christopher Joyce has the story.
So are we stuck with climate change? You could ask the president, as reporters from Axios on HBO did.
Is there climate change? Yeah. Will it go back like this? I mean, will it change back? Probably. That's what I think.
You could ask a senator about climate change, as a reporter did to Republican Ted Cruz from Texas when he was campaigning this fall.
Well, listen, of course the climate is changing. The climate has been changing from the dawn of time. The climate will change as long as we have a planet Earth.
Okay. So I wanted to share that with you because the sentiment that was shared there, which was that, of course, the climate is changing, the climate always changes, is one of the main arguments that climate skeptics use to disregard climate change. And so I wanted to talk about this and what we see from the data. So what I'm showing you here, this is a graph of temperature anomalies going from the year 2000 and then back over 1,000 years. So the way that we read this is on the far right bottom corner, we see the year 2000. And then as we move to the left, we see the 1800s, 1600s, and going all the way back, here is the year 1000. And then what we see on the y-axis, there's this little dashed black line going down the middle. That dashed line is showing the average temperature that was based on the 15 through the 1500s to 1850. So essentially like the average in this section here. Okay, so what this is showing us is we can see these red squiggly lines. Sometimes they're above the average, sometimes they're below, sometimes they're above, and sometimes they're below. What this is showing us is climate cycles that occur naturally based on geophysical properties of our Earth. So this part is true, as former President Donald Trump said, the climate is always changing. We do have climate fluctuations, and that is very true. But the really important thing to note is that what we see is that sometimes temperatures are higher, like we see in this period from 1000 to 1200, and then we can have a temperature dip, and then it will climb back up. and then it will stay up, and then it will dip and climb back up. And we see these cycles of ups and downs, but typically they turn around pretty quickly. And what we're seeing is that in this later period, after the 1800s, is we start to see that we are having increases in that temperature above the average, and it's not turning around. And so the important thing is that this is a sustained increase that's very steep. So it's steeper than we're seeing in the past, and it's sustained. And so that is a unique pattern as we look back in Earth's history. And so one of the things I always like to do is to have everybody imagine if you were presented with these types of data from some other kind of system that's like slow to change. So if I was looking at this and this was a time series of, let's say, body mass or some other feature, I would say, okay, this is not typical here at the end. We have a sustained increase. There's something different that's going on with this system where it's not turning back around. And so that's what's really important when it comes to the contemporary climate change and increases in surface temperature of the Earth that we're seeing. And now, oftentimes, another criticism that we hear, or skepticism that we hear as well, how can scientists know what Earth's temperature has been like so long ago? They just have models, and these models aren't that trustworthy. Well, the science behind reconstructing Earth's historical temperature is actually pretty straightforward. And so I just wanted to walk through with you some of the ways that scientists actually reconstruct historical temperatures, because it's really cool. And I think it kind of takes away some of the like nebulousness of thinking about climate change. And so here what I'm showing is an ice core. This is at least when I had pulled this up a couple of years ago, this was the oldest ice core that humans have discovered. So this is a 2.7 million year old ice core. And the cool thing about ice cores, and we often see ice cores from these really old ones coming from Antarctica, and then oftentimes we can find some in like glacial ice in the northern hemisphere, but the really old ones usually from Antarctica. But the way that ice sheets form is that every year when you have snow that falls, and then that snow can melt, and then when it gets cold again, it can refreeze. And so just in the same way that you have rings of a tree, where like trees are putting on their rings every year as they're growing their tissue, ice forms in that same way in terms of layers. So we can see this researcher standing near an ice core, and the ice at the top is the youngest ice, and the ice as we go down to the bottom is the oldest ice. And the really important thing about ice is that when ice is forming, it traps air bubbles. And so you really have two things in ice. You have the actual water that is made the ice, and then you have the air bubbles that are trapped in the ice. And you can really think about these air bubbles as little teeny tiny air samples of the air at that time. And so when you look at a trapped air bubble from a piece of ice that's 2.7 million years old, you're getting a sample of Earth's atmosphere at that time, and also the water that made the ice at that time. And the really amazing thing is that having that ancient water and also having the ancient air samples allows us to measure the past in terms of the oxygen, the carbon dioxide, the nitrogen, etc. And the really important thing is that when we look at water, there are actually different forms of water. And this is because we have what we call different isotopes. So water is made of a hydrogen, or two hydrogens and an oxygen, so H2O. And because we have different forms of hydrogen and different forms of oxygen, that means that we can have different combinations that come together to form water. And the reason that this becomes really important for us is because some of these water molecules, depending on which isotope of hydrogen and oxygen they have, some of them are heavy, like physically heavy, and some of them are light. And so what happens is if you imagine like a lake, and the water that is in that lake when it's really hot outside, it evaporates. And then that water that evaporates will eventually fall as snow and then melt and become ice, and it will be part of an ice core. But the really interesting thing is the water that we have on Earth is all made of these different combinations of heavy and light forms of water. And so the heavy water, it takes more energy and higher temperatures for it to evaporate and then go and form snow and then eventually ice. Whereas the light isotopes, they can actually evaporate at cooler temperatures. So what we can do, and what is done, is that when you take ice cores, you can actually just look at the ratio of how much heavy water is in that ice versus light water, and you can calculate how hot it was or cool it was at the time that that water evaporated. So in this way, we can actually go back through these ice cores, and just like a tree ring, we can study them and understand and reconstruct ancient temperatures, which is really amazing. And just so that I can get some bragging rights, I wanted to show an image of when I was a young scientist, having the opportunity to work doing ice cores in the Alaskan Arctic, which was really fun. But Antarctica is really the place to get ancient ice. Okay, and so just to kind of remind you that it's really that study of ice that allows us to be able to have a better understanding and reconstruct data on our planet and the warming of our planet, and better understand the processes at play that are leading to the current levels of global warming. Okay, so now that we understand how we can study Earth's temperature over deep time horizons, now we want to talk about, well, what's actually driving climate change? What's driving this recent steep and unique increase in global surface temperatures? So here is data that I pulled from an IPCC report. And so what I'm showing on the x-axis is the total amount of CO2, so carbon dioxide, that's been emitted since the late 1800s, so since 1870. And this is measured in gigatons. So it's like a lot of carbon dioxide. So this is the amount of carbon dioxide humans are putting in the atmosphere. And then on the y-axis, going up and down, is a temperature anomaly. So that's that increase in temperature above the average. And what we see is a pretty strong correlation where, as we have put more carbon dioxide in the environment, we also see, coincident with that, this increase in global surface temperatures. And really it has been this relationship that we've seen over time and has been studied by the IPCC since its inception, that has really led the scientific community to determining that it is the human-driven greenhouse gas emissions that are leading to this to climate change and the increase in global surface temperatures. And so we see that correlation, but we really want to have an understanding of, like, well, why is that? Why is it that when we put CO2 in the atmosphere, that leads to increases in global temperature around the world? And to understand that, we have to understand how greenhouse gases are working and why they even have their name, greenhouse gases. Okay, so if any of you have ever seen a greenhouse, like a greenhouse typically made of glass, and the reason why plants grow really well in a greenhouse is that because the greenhouse is clear, that means that the sunlight can actually get into the greenhouse. But when it's in the greenhouse, that solar energy is heat energy and it's warm. It warms the greenhouse. But because that glass is a physical barrier, that warmth stays in there and it doesn't go out and like dissipate into the air. And so it is this exact same process that greenhouse gases play in our environment. Just like the glass of a greenhouse gases sit in Earth's atmosphere and they allow the sun's sunlight to penetrate through. But then when that sunlight is actually heating our Earth's surfaces, that warmth isn't able to then dissipate, out past Earth's atmosphere because the greenhouse gases trap it in as if they were the glass of a greenhouse. And so that's the process that they're playing in our atmosphere. And even though we hear a lot about CO2 as a greenhouse gas, there are actually several greenhouse gases, actually water vapor, so just water hanging out in our atmosphere acts as a greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, which is the most notorious one, methane, ozone, and nitrous oxide. Those are all naturally occurring greenhouse gases. And some of those we release by human activities, like I mentioned, the carbon dioxide. But then there are also artificial man-made greenhouse gases. And this includes the chlorofluorocarbons, which used to be used in refrigerants and aerosols, but we have some international treaties to address those. And then fluorinated gases, which are often called F gases. And so the really important thing in the last subject that I want to touch on is the relationship between greenhouse gases and air pollutants. So it turns out that many of the air pollutants that exist can either act as greenhouse gases to warm our Earth, and some of them can act as cooling agents for our Earth. And also, like when we think about air pollution and where air pollutants are coming from, many of these compounds are actually coming from the same human activities that generate greenhouse gases. So one quote that I had found from a scientist on this topic was the same compounds that contribute to poor air quality can also impact Earth's radiative budget, meaning how hot or how cold the Earth is. And so I made a little diagram to try to illustrate this, where in yellow, I'm showing the greenhouse gases, and then the middle, the hazardous air pollutants. And then on the right, the pollutants that cause cooling. And I've kind of put all of them underneath, there are lots of them. But what I want you to take away from this image is that there's overlaps in these. So like ozone, for instance, is a greenhouse gas and also a hazardous air pollutant. Fine particulate matter is a hazardous air pollutant, and it's also it can act as a coolant of our atmosphere. And so there's a lot of intersections when it comes to these things. And when it comes to environmental justice, which is, where we started this discussion, it's really important to note that the human activities that lead to both air pollution and greenhouse gases, these are activities where they oftentimes are highly impacting environmental justice communities. So environmental justice communities are often the sites for fossil fuel extraction, for the transport of fossil fuels. And also when it comes to the burning of those fossil fuels and the harms that are done in the end with their use, it's often environmental justice communities that bear that burden. And so I wanted to just uplift a couple examples, with the Dakota Access Pipeline that would impact Indigenous lands, Indigenous peoples' water rights in the United States in order to move crude oil that from the Dakotas. And then, so you can think about the way that the livelihoods and of environmental justice communities and indigenous peoples are impacted by the extraction and the transport of these fossil fuels. And then on the other end of the pipeline, these fossil fuels are burned in our home, for instance, with gas stoves, which cause hazardous air pollutants in our home, and then also the burning of fossil fuels in vehicles and the overburden of vehicular and truck traffic in environmental justice communities. And so that's something to really keep in mind when we think about the kind of pipeline of fossil fuels and the harm that they do and where they're placed. And so with the last couple of minutes, because I want to leave time for some questions at the end, like 10 minutes or so, I just wanted to run through pretty quickly some of the health harms that come from air pollutants. And again, these air pollutants are being driven by vehicular traffic, burning fossil fuels for heating buildings, and they cooking stoves, etc. And they really can be harmful for our health, especially when it comes to chronic diseases. So one of the big air pollutants is particulate matter, which we often call PM. So an abbreviation for particulate matter. So PM 2.5 is referring to particulate matter that's less than 2.5 micrograms. So this is super tiny. So a human hair is 50 to 70, micrometers is what I meant to say, is 50 to 70 micrometers is illustrated here. And then if you look at this teeny tiny little dot down here, that is less than, would be the, to scale compared to human hair, the size of what 2.5 micrometers would be. So it's very, very tiny. And the reason that I'm explaining that is because it's those teeny tiny particles and the size of them that makes them harmful for our health. So what happens is when we breathe in air that has this really fine particulate matter and it gets deep into our lungs, it can get into our alveoli, which are these little air sacs in our lungs. And because that particulate matter is so small and so fine, it can pass through those little air sacs and get into our bloodstream. And once that those fine particles are in our bloodstream, they can cause inflammation, so reaction of our immune system. They can even cause our blood to coagulate. And this is really important to know when we, especially when thinking about cardiovascular disease, because we're breathing in these fine particles, they're getting in our lungs, moving from our lungs to our bloodstream. And you can imagine having little teeny tiny particles floating around your bloodstream is not going to be good for your heart. And so research that's been done by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has shown that exposure to PM 2.5 over a few weeks or even hours can trigger cardiovascular health problems. So heart palpitations, fatigue, lightheadedness, shortness of breath. And so it can have a very direct impact on our health. And then the other air pollutant that I wanted to mention is ozone. I had talked about ozone earlier in that graph when I was speaking about the fact that ozone is not only a greenhouse gas, but it's also a harmful air pollutant. So ozone is really interesting because it forms under very specific condition. So what happens is when you have cars and buildings that are burning fossil fuels, they will release nitrogen oxides. So these are molecules that have a combination of nitrogen and oxygen. And then another type of pollutant that we have, which are known as volatile organic compounds, which include really nasty things like formaldehyde, which we use for embalming and can be found in like shampoos and carpets and things. Well, what happens is we have these volatile organic compounds coming from various sources of different materials and products. And then we have these nitrogen oxides that are coming from vehicles and burning fuel. And when it's hot out, these things come together and form a chemical reaction that then releases ozone. And the really nasty thing about ozone is a gas that when we breathe it in, it literally can burn our lungs. And so one of the ways that ozone is often talked about is that because it's essentially causing like the equivalent of a sunburn in our lungs and causing extreme irritation and inflammation, which can make it difficult to breathe. It can cause coughing, give a person a scratchy throat. It can even make us susceptible to infection or have asthma attacks. And so just those two things, and we only talked about two air pollutants, PM 2.5 and ozone, can have direct health impacts when we're exposed. And the really important thing to know is that these exposures don't just happen when we're outside. These exposures can also happen in the home. So for those of you that live in New York City, many of us have window air conditioners. And we have a lot of exchange of air from outdoors to indoors. So oftentimes, even though we might feel like we're being protected in our house, we can have what we call like infiltration of air from the outside to the inside and still get some of these harmful air pollutant exposures. And so one thing that can be really useful resource for everyone is to understand the air quality index. So if you have a smartphone and you have the weather app, you can also look when you're checking the weather to see the air quality index. And I'll also give you a link to EPA's air quality index in the next slide. But the really good thing is that the air quality index is an index that's a composite of looking at the levels of the various types of air pollutants and then giving just one number to tell you how safe or unsafe the air is outside. And so the air quality index is going from a scale typically from 0 to 500. So if it's 0 to 50, it's good. And that means you can go enjoy your outdoor activities, don't have to worry too much. And then we have kind of increasing levels that can be harmful for our health. So when we get to a level of 101 to 150, this can be bad for sensitive groups. So people that have respiratory conditions or, children with asthma, et cetera, or people with heart conditions. And then when we get to the level over 151, then it's unhealthy. And so sensitive groups definitely shouldn't go outdoors. And for people that might not have any of those chronic diseases still need to be wary. And then when we get above 200, then that's very unhealthy. And above 300, we're looking at the hazardous level for everyone. And in those cases, we all want to avoid outdoor activity and exerting ourselves. And the reason that we want to avoid exerting ourselves when the air is bad is because when we're exerting ourselves and we're breathing a lot, like as we're taking in more of that air, that's more of those pollutants that we're taking into our body. And so the last slide that I wanted to share with you is the Air Now website. And so if you can either go to this website, www.airnow.gov, or you can just type into Google EPA Air Now. And this will tell you for your zip code what the current air quality is. And so I find that really helpful resource when you're planning out your day. And just to have a better understanding of our air and how much it's changing from day to day. And so it looks like that is my last slide. And it looks like I maybe have a question in the chat. Oh, no, it was not a question. It was just a comment. So, yep, I just wanted to take the last 10 minutes or so for any questions or any comments anyone may have. And feel free to raise your hand. Okay, I see one hand raised. Is it Michelle? if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I've been kind of just listening, but I figured, I'll take the opportunity to just ask a question. But the reason why I joined the session tonight was because we're working on a county-wide community climate action plan for Ulster County, New York, and looking to engage, residents, all community members, but definitely especially in disadvantaged communities, as defined by the state, but as you're saying, any environmental justice areas. So I guess, have you worked a lot? I don't know. I guess my question is just around community education, and how to connect, the science and health, and then turn that into action through
Yeah,
solutions. I know it's a big question. It's like, but I don't know if you have just insight in your experience, what works well for you,
yeah. So I'll have to say that I am like pretty new to the community-based organization work. I've been at WEAC for a little bit over a year. But what I have found is that community members are like super into this topic and are oftentimes incredibly knowledgeable. And so I very rarely do I really have to kind of switch up content when it comes to working with community members, because they're just like super in the know. And I think that with information, and especially like science and science reporting and such being more readily available these days, that yeah, community members are just like totally with it when it comes to the subject. So we at WEACT, we have working groups where we engage with community members around issues of climate change, beauty justice, indoor exposures in their homes, etc. So I would say when it comes to planning out like topics for the community, it's really best to just ask what are the things that they want kind of lessons built up around, because oftentimes they are incredibly knowledgeable and will have particular areas that they're super interested in, or find a gap, like a knowledge gap that they want filled. And then, it's for us to go and do the research and figure out the information to bring to them. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And then I see John has a question. Oh, okay. Let's see. Let's see if I can hear you. For some reason, I'm not getting any audio, and it doesn't look like you're muted either. Oh, okay. I think I can hear you now.
You hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. I wanted to, excuse me. Thank you for your presentation. It was very informational, interesting, and thought-provoking. I have used material from WEAC in the past 3 Earth Days that we have had, at the Kennedy Center. Brianna came and she did a presentation. This was last Monday. So what I have found is that using the information from the various sources and delivering them through like video, having people come and talk as well, and to give information that way, and to also do what you're doing now, open up for discussion. That helps to educate the people who are coming, to the presentation. I have found that they come because they're really motivated and they're interested, and they are concerned about what they can do, in order to shall we say, have an impact. A lot of them came and they talked about when the sky turned orange.
Mhm.
And they were, concerned about that. And some have expressed a desire to, they want to know, how can we reach young people? Because young people, have more energy and so there's a lot of interest in trying to mobilize youth. So do you have any comments about how to mobilize youth?
Yeah, I would say it really is connecting with the youth that are already mobilized, because there has been so much climate action by youth. I don't know if you were able to attend the most recent climate march in New York, but it was amazing how many young people were there. I would say that they're probably the majority. We have been engaging with youth through our We Act co-chairs the Climate Resilience Education Task Force. It's a task force to try to get climate change mandated to be taught in New York State curriculum. And actually with that, it's been really amazing because we have a youth steering committee that's mostly high school students. And so really just giving them a space and like food for when they meet once a month to, draw plans. And they've very actively multiple times now gone up to talk to our state legislature. And from what I've heard from some of our staff members that have joined the youth on that, they're like very powerful and like super on point. So I think that for those of us like later generations, like myself, it really is just for us to like, to connect with those youth that are already kind of movers and shakers in this space, and figure out how to have that communication.
Okay.
Oh yeah, so the name of the initiative to get climate education in New York is it's the Climate Resilience Education Task Force. Give me 1 second. I'm going to stop share and I will get you that website. And then if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand.
Is that Emily's group?
Emily Fano, yes. She
Okay, yes.
is one of the co-directors. And I see and I just dropped it in the chat, the link. And then Nicholas, if you want to unmute yourself and ask. I see your hand.
Hi. This is Nicholas Ferreira. I'm from EPA Region 2, and I just wanted to say that the presentation that you put on was incredible. I think you guys did a really great job of simplifying some really difficult topics. I work in the Air and Radiation Division, so I really appreciate the way that you guys put this presentation together, and I'm looking forward to reviewing the slides and hopefully using some of them, because the way you put them together was really good, great way you did it. So I'm also the climate change and environmental justice rep for the Air and Radiation Division, so this presentation aligned perfectly with the work I do. So thank you for putting this together.
Oh, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Wonderful. So we're right at 7 p.m. I'm happy to take 1 or 2 last questions if anybody has them. Oh, and Sada, I believe you had a couple more slides. I'll pull those up. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Hi, hello. Can you all hear me?
Yep. Did we have one more question?
Yes, hi. My name's Brandon. I represent Aaliyah. I put a question in here. And I'll just read it out loud. So I said, as a local community-based nonprofit, how do we navigate the gaps in communication and establish impactful activity on the ground, considering only a federal or a regional body might hold control over something rather than a local-based municipal agency that might be more available to talk? A good example I put in the comment is would be to solve for local pollution vectors produced from the national highways, and also how that relates to, you know, the FWHA. So a lot of people locally, I think one of the other individuals earlier had mentioned about local youth. So sometimes it's hard to explain to local youth that a roadblock is the fact that you need to engage federally. So do you have any suggestions or advice on that?
Yeah, so and this is something I've really just learned from being a part of We Act, which is that, so I think the example that you gave was, you know, really on point, that it's like, you know, sometimes we have, oftentimes we have issues that we're seeing on a very hyper local scale. But then when it comes to the people that are in power for making decisions that are, you know, driving that pollutant or that system of environmental racism, et cetera, might not be hyper local. They might be at other levels, whether that's the decision makers at the state level, at the federal level. It could also even have to do with like international governance and such. And so one of the ways that We Act has sought to address this is to do advocacy on all levels and really try to understand kind of the levers of power and regulation at all levels. So I can give you one example of something that we're working on that I think is a good illustrative example, where one issue that I work on is the presence of mercury in skin lightening products. So these are beauty products marketed to women of color. And so what we do to address this, because this is an issue that spans many levels, is we work with our local Department of Health to try to identify these products. And then we use those data, we've used those data to advocate at the state level for a ban. We also are constantly requesting meetings with our federal regulators at the FDA saying, hey, here's this problem. We would like enforcement of policy to keep these products from being manufactured and imported into the country. But then also when we don't get you know, people listening at those levels, we take it even to another level. So we've also taken it to the United Nations to say, hey, the United States is a part of a treaty where we're not supposed to be having mercury in skin lightening products. Can you help us to address this issue? And so it's one of those cases where we have to work kind of at all levels and understand the systems of power and be brave enough to like insert ourselves and say, hey, we can advocate on all of those different levels. And I hope that helps.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And
Also, oh, go
that's
ahead,
a great
sorry.
example about the mercury. Thank you for that.
And we have two questions in the chat, Dr. Martinez. One is from Kevin Bearfield. It says, can you explain what's more dangerous, methane gas or the combination of particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, cadmium, nickel, and mercury? And then there's one more
Ooh.
after that.
Okay. I actually think that I can't answer that because, yeah, what's more dangerous in terms of these combinations? Because so we have, so methane, like burning methane in the home, which is what we do with our gas stoves, that releases certain hazardous air pollutants like nitrogen dioxide, which can be hazardous for our health. And then, you know, that has its own set of health implications. But then when we look at combinations of things like, you know, like you said, the particulate matter, you have the nitrogen oxide, which I mentioned, they can be harmful themselves. They can also lead to the production of ozone. And cadmium, nickel, and mercury, when you start to get to the heavy metals, those have their whole slew of health outcomes as well. You know, mercury is a neurotoxin, so that can damage your nervous system. So the important thing to think about when considering all of these pollutants is they all have their own biological like impacts on our health, and they all interact with the different organs and cellular systems in our bodies differently. So it's really going to depend on the dose of exposure, the duration of exposure, what life stage, you know, if you have a pregnant woman who's exposed to PM 2.5 or mercury, where they can transfer it to their fetus, that's an incredibly dangerous situation. So you have to think about the life stage, like how vulnerable a person is, are they at a reproductive stage in their life, and then also the level of exposure. So you could have a situation where, depending on the level and the combination, methane might be more dangerous than some of these others, or this other combination is more dangerous than methane. It's totally going to depend on life stage, dose, etc. So, yep, that's my answer to that one. And then was there one more?
There was one more, there's two more, but I think you kind of answered from Lee, we have after taking this training, what would you recommend as the next step to learn more about EJ is one of them. And then from Michelle, we have, what is the name of the initiative to get climate education in NYS schools?
Oh, yeah. So I put the link of the initiative. It's the Climate Resilience Education Task Force, and I put the link up in the chat. And then sign up for WEAC's newsletter. If you are local in New York, we will be teaching an environmental justice class. I'll be teaching environmental justice out of CUNY School of Public Health, where I'm going to have it open to 10 community members to also join for the semester, like totally free, sitting on the classes. So if that's something that you're looking for. Also, I know we will be having more open community trainings through the TCTAC and throughout the next year or so. So I'm sure that Sada can talk about that, and we will cover other topics.
All right, with that, we want to thank you, Dr. Martinez, for doing such a great entry point into climate justice and environmental justice. Dr. Martinez will be hosting more webinars in the years to come. So we're really lucky to have her be supporting our EHJLT for the regions of New York and New Jersey. We would like to ask if you guys could take a moment to complete this very short survey. We are doing these webinars for the community. We will have in-person trainings in upcoming months and years of the program. So do take this. It helps us better support you and provide you all the resources you need. And if you aren't yet, please do join our mailing list. We are doing pretty regularly monthly webinars, and soon we'll be doing more in-person stuff in the New York, New Jersey region. So thank you again, Dr. Martinez, and thank you all for attending. And with that, have a lovely night.